Okay,
Excellent.
cool. And we're recording.
Thank you.
Cool.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in person, those of you who are here, and those of you who are joining online. Again, it's nice to see both new and familiar names there. As last time, I just wanted to invite you, if you have any questions from yesterday's lecture, this would be a fine time to ask anything you'd like there.
Not really a question, but I started reading music yesterday, like online. Translation was beautiful. Like, I don't know, I feel it's beautiful, the poetry. That's all I say.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah, yesterday we got to the point that so that there is about the Reformation, the response to the focus on arahatship rather than become Buddhahood. People resign. That you mentioned, people resign some part of the poetry. Have you found something that I would say contradiction between what really the text say and then what people do differently? For example, my text, the Dhammachai text, so really the text described the Buddhahood, becoming the Buddhahood, but the way people use it clearly said that so for the practitioner of this text, so we recite this text regularly in order to attain arahatship rather than becoming the Buddha himself in the future. So have you ever?
That kind of tension between doctrinally what's happening
Yeah.
in a text and what people talk about what they're doing, either in a present day context or what evidence we might have for that in a historical context.
Yeah.
I don't have a good example offhand, I think, other than what the kinds of examples that you've raised around this tension between what is the key soteriological goal or mode of liberation that people are articulating in a given text or in a given practice. Something that we'll see a little bit later today is, I think I mentioned it yesterday, that we'd come to a text where it describes all the things that Buddhists in a certain context should not do, but do anyways. And I think that's a very interesting list for us to consider with regards to your question. And it relates to, I think, a key idea that shows up across a number of different Southeast Asian Buddhist texts, particularly in a Cambodian context, that is that being a human being involves a certain degree of violence to the world. Some aspects of unwholesome karma from this perspective are inevitable. So therefore, what kinds of rituals might be constructed to absolve or to seek repentance, to take leave of the kinds of karmic results that are incurred by an ordinary, inevitable course of human life. So I think that's also a question. It's like, is it describing maybe in the other direction, like a much more violent life than people might frame their particular aspirations today, even though a text like that is still used. So I think it could be asked from multiple angles. I hope that gets at some of, there's a lot going on in your question, but I hope it gets at some of that. Anything, those of you who are joining us on Zoom, if you want to put any questions in the chat or ask directly, just wanted to give you this opportunity. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump right in to the topic for today. Wonderful. So today, I want to bring up one text that I think will help us transition a bit from the theme we were exploring yesterday around prayer and aspiration and how we might think about that showing up in these different types of verse texts. And the theme that I'll be more explicitly focusing on today, that is around questions of debt particularly familial debt. So to go to the text that I think will help us bridge this. I have temporarily misplaced this text. So here it is. Okay. So this is a text that in Khmer is called Anisang Akarwata. In other words, the benefits of the recitation, memorization, copying, performance of the this particular non-canonical Pali text that's more commonly colloquially known as the Kawada in Khmer, or again with this slightly more formal Pali name, Akarawata. This is a text for which one version has been edited by Padmanath Jaini. That's of the Pali text, that is. This is a vernacular Khmer text that articulates the anisangsa, the benefits of that particular Pali text. And it only appears, to my knowledge, in one manuscript. This manuscript comes from what was then Gong Mia province, what's now part of Kong Jam province in Cambodia, a little bit north and east of Phnom Penh. Sometime in the late 19th or maybe early 20th centuries by a particular layperson who was a poet named Hun. So this is an edition and translation of that text. We'll just look at some of the features of it. So as we saw yesterday, very commonly the beginnings of these kinds of Buddhist poems all across mainland Southeast Asia have verses of praise at the beginning. So we have here, I composed this in the Brahmakat, this Brahmagiti or Brahma song meter. Again, as we went through the other day with this alternating pattern of 5 and 6 syllables with linking rhymes, prostrating before the teacher whose heart is compassionate, ever kind, and enlightening. That is the Buddha. And then to the other 2 of the 3 jewels, to the Dharma and to the Sangha. Then after this opening homage, we have this appeal to ask for the very blessings or benefits that are to be conferred from the composition and recitation of this text. I humbly ask for the blessings to be my refuge till Nibbana. Then we get this even more specific prayer, one that comes in a more autobiographical direction. Beginning with, moreover, may I now make this solemn prayer. And the word here that I'm translating as prayer is Satya Pranidhana or Satya Pranithiyan in Khmer. One of the terms we were looking at for aspiration yesterday. So it'd be fine to translate this as a truthful aspiration or something else like that. May the omniscient gods residing in all quarters assist me as my witness, listening to my uttered wish, the true words that I vow to be enlightened as a Buddha. The virtues of my mother and of my father, and of course, this will be the theme that we're looking at today, this question of how do virtues and debts towards family, teachers, other people show up in Buddhist poetry? What do they tell us about how Buddhist poetry is being structured and crafted? Ever precise, and of my preceptor, that is the one who ordained Hun as a monk in his youth, to whom I bow, and of teachers and relatives. May they help me truly as per my aspiration. And then he asks to repay these debts. Here the phrasing is song kun. This is one of various number of phrases that are used in Khmer to articulate this idea of repaying debts. I vow to repay my debts to them when I reach the fruit, that is, when he attains the fruit of Buddhahood, and to save living beings, that is, acting as a Buddha should act, so that they are free from worry, abandon and cast off evil acts, and enjoy bliss as they wish. So this is the opening we see. And in many ways, it parallels the opening we saw in Sang Sin Sai, in that masterpiece of Lao literature, where we have an opening mangala of praise to the 3 jewels, and then also asking for the benefits of composing such a piece, and also asking for assistance from those of virtue to be of witness to this act of writing and composition. Then we have the very specific portion that says what exactly is the meritorious action that's being done. And here it's, again, the composing of a text. I intend to arrange and express the Buddha's words. When the Lord preached about the one who recites this akaravatta and strives to ponder it, to whom benefits will accrue to destroy all pain and sin. Then, this is the part that I'll skip in my presentation here. We have the core portion of the text that goes into this detail around what exactly are the benefits of reciting this particular text. This is a text that, again, is known, not this vernacular poem, but the Pali text is one that shows up all across Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos. So I will skip this portion for now. If you're interested, you can find it in my dissertation. Then towards the end, we have a recapitulation of what he's done. And then again, this trying to connect autobiographically to what's going on. And here we have this, again, this invocation of what his actual life is like, Hun, this particular poet, and how it connects to himself, his family, and his aspirations. So here, ending this particular explanation of the benefits of the Akaravatta, we have this explanation of the fruits has been abbreviated according to convention. It's very, very common conventionally for such Southeast Asian poems to say that they are merely short versions, merely abbreviated versions of what should be a much longer exposition. And this can occur in a relatively short text, it's about 60 stanzas, but it also can occur in texts that are hundreds or thousands of stanzas long. Still this insistence that, well, this is really just a short version. As a fruit for me in the future, set down as sufficient for seeking refuge and chastising the mind. And again, we have this kind of apology, very common that one would see in Buddhist literature, particularly verse texts of this type. You see it also in manuscript colophons. If any of you should read this, don't call it immature. Please take pity on me, since I fear I may be wrong, corrupt, or not so correct according to tradition. Since I have but little wisdom, and here the text is fragmentary, not in accordance to custom, the way of people of the past, please help rectify it so it is correct. Don't criticize it. In other words, he's inviting the readership of this text, those who may be reading it, those who may be listening to it, to work to make it better. Of course, we see texts like this changing and growing over time. This particular one, I'm only able to find in this manuscript. I don't know whether it's a autograph. In other words, the poet himself wrote it in the very physical manuscript in which I came across it, or it had been already copied and shared beyond that. Geographically, it's in exactly the right place, but it's hard to know if this is, of course, his particular handwriting. Taking this fruit as a basis, your virtues shall be extremely exalted, massively large beyond compare, like a great ship crossing the waters, for you clearly see into the precious dharma, and your virtues cannot be explained. Then we get his own actual autobiography. As for my own name, in its original powerful letters, the lovely letter H, cleft by a U and finished with an N. In other words, this ha, u, and no, that is the way of spelling the name Hun in Khmer. This kind of name riddle is very common in Cambodian literature of this period. Manifest in script and spelled according to the method, the way we spell my name is Hun, don't doubt it. Born into Praia district to an excellent family in precious Jung Prai province, the child of a rural government official, I ordained and studied within the Buddhist religion, striving to quickly write according to Pali with my uneducated mind. I came to stay in Praia monastery, where the lay people were not disruptive, following what my teacher taught me, to chant and study according to tradition. Due only to my unwholesome states, which caused me to suffer inside, I struggled to change, but could not contain them. So I disrobed and became a layman. So presumably this is a reference to he's struggling with celibacy. And it's very common to see these kinds of admissions in sometimes manuscript colophons, sometimes in poetry like this, that former monks might acknowledge that the very act of being monk, particularly being celibate, was not something that they were able to maintain throughout their life. And here we have continuing to state what his life was like after the time of disrobing. I began to make a living according to need, without deceit, settling in the great village named Oberti. As for me, I am bereft of my precious parents. I now take shelter with my elder sibling. Such are my difficulties. When I was still a monk, my mind was straight and generous. I tried to test my wits. Close this in the Brahmakat meter. For the continuation of the religion of the teacher is appropriate to worship him. His virtues are massive and manifold, always saving beings. Since my heart is true and seeks peace in my own being, may I not be distantly cleft from my wish to become a Buddha. May I attain according to this vow that I pray earnestly, bowing low. May I become a Buddha in the future according to my affinities, for the benefits that ferry across like a precious great vessel that lead incalculable numbers of living beings to arrive at the far shore, that is Nirvana. Finished, and this is here bringing in this Pali term lipitang, completely ended. This is concluded in the main. It stops now, normal recounting, thus it ends right here. And the conventions that I wanted to bring out here, just to recapitulate what we went through yesterday, is this close link between how aspirations are articulated and the particular nature of the poet's life, and how that life shows up in these beginning and ending portions of this kind of Buddhist verse. And as for the transition into our topic today, of course, you notice that when talking about his life growing up, he mentions his parents. Then the big change that happens, of course, after his ordination is the death of his parents. And that this forms a way of framing his life, as well as at the very beginning, he invokes this gun, or guna, the virtues of his parents. So let's now go into this question of what is meant by virtue or debt in regards to parents in a Southeast Asian Buddhist context. So the term that I'm using here to translate debt is one that's quite multivalent. This term guna in Pali and Sanskrit, pronounced in different ways in mainland Southeast Asian languages, has the basic sense of quality. And on the basis of that basic sense, we also get this extended meaning of virtue. In other words, virtues being the kind of positive qualities that would be connected to a particular person, thing, state, etc. So a very common context in which we see this idea of guna appearing in Buddhist texts. Not so much in the Tipitaka, but certainly later in Buddhist traditions, is this idea of Buddha guna. That is the virtues of the Buddha. Within many Theravada contexts later in Buddhist history, this term Buddha guna is sometimes connected to the 9 or 10 epithets of the Buddha that begin with itipiso, bhagawa, etc. In other cases, it can be connected to much longer lists and more elaborate understandings, not just of the epithets of the Buddha, but all the different aspects that can be considered a certain quality or a certain virtue of the Buddha. Beyond that, however, this term gets extended to a wide range of other beings. And here we have this sense that it's not just virtue, but it's somehow virtuous beings are those to whom we owe a debt. In other words, on account of their virtue, this is why we have this sense of indebtedness. So that applies equally to the Buddha or the Dharma and the Sangha in the way this is framed in a Southeast Asian Buddhist context, as well as other things to whom this guna is attributed, like that of the earth or of various deities, of teachers, etc. So Alexander Trent has a question here. what is the motivation behind wanting to repay one's debts instead of appreciating or acknowledging that they might not be able to be repaid, whether in full or at all? Though one's parents are always going to be fundamental, for example, does the desire to repay that debt regardless imply that one is ultimately wanting to detach themselves or move on from those they owe a debt to? Fantastic question. And I think there are a number of ways we could approach this. Certainly within the texts that I'm looking at, which are by and large between the 16th and 19th centuries, there are different verbs that are used around how to relate to this kind of debt. So I've put some of these down here as the third major point on this slide. So one way to think about it is this contrast between knowing debts and repaying them. And this idea of knowing and repaying are sometimes separated, and sometimes they're really thought of as together in some way. So terms for knowing debts, terms that we might sometimes describe as gratitude or being grateful in English, include a Sanskrit term like kritagnya, literally knowing what has been done, krita, and then implied on one's behalf. And then its Pali equivalents, katanyu and katavedi, similar kind of sense. These are very commonly used in a reference to the relationship between children and parents. Those who are grateful, those who are katanyu in this context, are those who both know, that's the literal sense of these terms, they know and have this sense of appreciation for this debt. And as you put it, Alexander, might appreciating or acknowledging that they might not be able to repay it in full. I think that's part of the dimension of this knowing. It's knowing that the debt of parents is limitless. And certainly there are lots of examples of, in a Chinese or Vietnamese context, or in a Cambodian or Thai countries, that try to compare the debt of parents to something that's limitless, something that can never be repaid. So that's definitely there. But there's also this sense in these terms like certainly kritagnya, katanyu, katavedi, but also a term like bangkun. That's this Khmer version, or ru bun kun, or big etc. in a Vietnamese context, that one who knows this debt, one who knows the virtues of one's parents, according to this line of thinking, is also one who repays them, who is able to song kun, kun in a kun in a Khmer context, or bao đáp công ơn cha mẹ in a Vietnamese context, etc. And so I think it's sometimes very difficult to tease apart these this question, whether knowing necessarily means repaying. There's a second part of your question that I think is not so much developed in the text I'm familiar with, but let's keep it open as a question as we look through the materials today. That is, does the desire to repay that debt imply that one is ultimately wanting to detach themselves or move on from those they owe a debt to? I think that becomes very relevant to consider in the context of monastic ordination, because monastic ordination, we'll see this in a text soon from a Thai source, is both an opportunity to repay that debt to one's parents, the most effective way of repaying that debt according to these kinds of traditional texts and rituals. But it's also the act of ordaining is separating oneself from one's family. One must ritually at least say goodbye to one's parents in that kind of context. So does that mean a kind of moving on, as you've expressed it, Alexander? Let's see. So let's keep that question in mind. Moving up one point on this slide, the guna of parents, this can be expressed in different ways in different languages. In Khmer, it's often expressed as gun mya da like that. In the case of Thai, usually this other word, bun, which is the Thai pronunciation of punya, may be added as well for a phrase like "un kun pame." But sometimes "kun" on its own can have this sense as well, but it's a quite multivalent term in Thai. In Vietnamese, there's a number of different terms. A particularly common or formal formulation is "công ơn Dhammachai," but there are a variety of other ones that could be used as well. What I want to get to a little bit, and we'll see how the course of our conversation goes, is the relationship not just between knowing and repaying these kinds of debts, but also between the celebration of those kinds of debts and grief or mourning when there's a risk that they cannot be repaid in some way. And this can be from the perspective of a parent or from the perspective of a child. And I think this too gets to what you're getting at, Alexander, with this idea of appreciating or acknowledging. I mean, certainly some of these texts are really on exploring this idea of how to celebrate the virtues of parents. Others are really focused on this question of grief, like, oh, I was not able to fulfill these kinds of filial obligations, or my child is leaving me at this moment of great need. That is also very much connected to what's going on. And I think what we will see is how narratives of mourning and loss can become key focal points for recalling this virtue. And that's when we see these links between poetry composed in Southeast Asia outside of an explicit Buddhist context, really intersecting with these Buddhist frameworks around filial debts. So with that overall framework in mind, let's take a look at some of the specific texts. So as I mentioned before, I thought we could begin by thinking about the context of monastic ordination. So this is a wonderful poem by Pramahā Thongyoi Warakgovinto. And even the monastic name of Pramahā Thongyoi, this name, Varagovinda, literally has this sense of he who is the chief among excellent poets. That's one way of translating that monastic name. So seemed destined for a career in poetry. And this particular one, this poem is called Dhammachai Pawat Kam Glon, or the Glon poem that tells the process or the tale of ordination, Dhammachai, or Papaja in Pali. And there's this wonderful bilingual edition of it with a very sophisticated English translation by Thomas Silcock. This went out of print a long time ago. But as you see, when you look at the text itself, he did, I think, a really incredible job with making the key aspects of the Glon meter in Thai come across in English. So if we just look on the top right here, we can see, though it's in 10 syllables instead of 8, it captures these complex rhymes. Hot is, well, it's rhyming with sit, isn't a perfect rhyme, but ease and phase and choose and vain and slain, then and him, and obligation, renunciation, persuasion, petition, will, ill, fail, tell, etc. These kinds of rhymes are all being set up in a similar or analogous kind of way to how they are in the Thai. It means that in any kind of translation like this, it's not going to be as closely literal, but I think it does a very admirable job in both giving the flavor and the content of what's happening. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what's happening here. This story begins, these are just excerpts and starting already on line 180 here of a much longer text. This is from relatively close to the beginning. And I forget the name of the father. The mother's name is Jan, and her son's name is Pian. Oh, sorry, In is the father's name, and Jan is the mother's name. And their son Pian was originally a boy educated as a non-ordained young child at a temple, and then having grown up, his parents are thinking, as young men do with tempers ever hot, this is from the top here, who sleep, eat, sit, or stand never at ease. Odin thought, now he's in a dangerous phase. He may well choose a crooked path in vain. If left to seek his fun at his own will, he'll end in Gaul, or be destroyed and slain. This year is rabbit, next is dragon, then we must ordain him, bind his obligation. And John agrees. They'll have this son they love tread the way of the great renunciation. And so they called their son, and their persuasion and sweet petition soothed and caressed his will. And then we have this brief section that shows how they're trying to convince him that, well, in order to fulfill this obligation of yours as a son, you need to ordain as a monastic. Dear boy, the blight of age blasts every creature. It is but nature, none escapes this ill. Mother and I grow older, fade and fail, and cannot tell when we too shall be dead. From birth till now, we too could rear and love you. No honor gave you, yet no craven need. No wealth we leave, no store of treasures stowed. To farm for food is all the skill we've taught you. And though to rear a child's a strenuous task, we do not ask returns for what we've brought you. Only when earth claims us and we desert you to share your virtue, a monk to bless our sleep. Now, this here is when we have a bit of a problem in the translation, in the sense that the word that Sokak has translated as sleep here, subin, looking back to the Thai on this side, wang hai lu ben subin he subun. So subin here does not, though literally this term means dream or sleep. This is not the sense of what's happening here. So there's a very important Thai narrative known as Subin Kuman that we have evidence of being recited and used in Thailand since I think at least the 18th century, maybe earlier. And there's a wonderful recent PhD thesis on this text at Chulalongkorn that came out recently. And if you're interested in there also exists a Khmer translation of it. I did the English translation of the Khmer version in my dissertation as well. But the core of the narrative is around this young monk who wants to ordain, but his mom doesn't want him to. And his father is a hunter and slaying all kinds of animals. And it's through the benefit of his ordination that he's able to save his parents from a painful fate. And so the sense here that narrative gets reproduced in each time someone is ordained within this Thai or Cambodian context, when that story has such an importance. And then we have going on describing, like, what's that they'll pool their resources together in order to be able to sponsor the ordination ceremony, which is much of what is described so elaborately in this poem. And then a sense that this is very important to the parents. So starting in this line down near the bottom, let us in your death just see your habits hem. In other words, just the edge of the robe, cling there and come clear over sorrow's river. And that image is one that is exactly what's happening in the story of Subin Kuman, that his mother, when has this either a dream or she's really in the hells, sees this glimpse of the robe and is able to have that lift her out from a lifetime of suffering in the hells. Let me move on now to the way some of these ideas around debt to parents is expressed, also again in Thai literature, but outside of a strictly Buddhist context. And now let's see, are some of the questions around debt and virtue the same, or might we see them come to new light in this kind of context? So the example that I wanted to bring up here is from Mili Pralaw. This is one of the gems of early Ayutthaya period literature. It's likely that the text as we have it, which kind of comes down to us in, I think, 18th and 19th century manuscripts, has gone a lot of change over the centuries and presumably was something told in an oral storytelling context. And the particular forms of poetry, lilit, meaning that it combines two key and very old types of Thai poetry, that of prai, which is a kind of rhymed prose, is a way to think about it in English, and klong, which is a much more formalized structure based on the basic concepts of prai poetry. But it's a poetry that has many parallels with other Thai languages within mainland Southeast Asia, and is one that fits the phonological principles of those tonal languages, particularly before something called the Great Tone Split, which was a change that affected all Southwestern Thai languages approximately 500 years ago. Leading what was originally a system of 3 principal tones to the 5 or 6 tone systems we see across these languages today. So the way that the structures work when reading it in contemporary phonology of Thai maybe isn't the way it would resonate in the past, but it gives us a sense of how this poetry worked. The story of Lilit Pralaw, and there are now 2 wonderful English translations available, one by Pasupong Pajit and Chris Baker, and another by Robert Bickner, who the latter who'd been working on the text for at least 40 years. So it's both very learned and wonderful translations. And the overall narrative is one that doesn't necessarily correspond to any kind of Buddhist context. And sometimes in Thai literary criticism, it's discussed really as a Buddhist text. Bickner, for instance, argues quite strongly against that idea that it should be understood as a Buddhist text. So we can sort of think about those competing arguments when we look at the passage, but we'll look at soon, that's about how Pralaw's mother is lamenting that her son is leaving her. So let me fill you in on the story a little bit first. So this is a story of 2 kingdoms, and Law is originally Prince Law, and his father leads a military expedition to the neighboring kingdom, and in the process, the king of that neighboring kingdom is killed. But sovereignty doesn't seem to, that kingdom seems to retain their sovereignty after this loss of their king. Eventually, Law's father retires, and Law himself becomes king. And then, of course, the son of the deceased king in the neighboring kingdom becomes king as well. And the beauty of now King Law is one that's celebrated throughout the land. And so much so that bards and those singing this kind of oral poetry, which is sort of exactly the style that this poem is composed in, would praise it to neighboring kingdoms as well. And the granddaughters of the slain king of the neighboring kingdom, or the daughters of that king, Prapuan and Prapang, hear this song about the beauty of, or the handsomeness of King Law, and completely fall in love. They're completely smitten and decide that we need to meet him. This is the one goal that we need to achieve. So they then begin to work with their attendants and have someone come recite a poem to Law about the beauty of these 2 princesses. He then is attracted to them, but in order to make this union come together, they have to rely, in other words, Prapuan and Prapang and their ladies in waiting have to invoke and seek out powerful sorcerers in order to convince Law to leave his kingdom and travel over to their kingdom to have a clandestine union. And so much of the story is about this going back and forth between rival sorcerers to bring Law over. Eventually, he makes it over. First, the 2 attendants of Law and the 2 attendants of Puan and Pang have a dalliance in the garden, in a a orgiastic sex scene, in other words. And then that eventually leads to Law and Puan and Pang similarly finally uniting together in a scene of both erotic and also lots of symbolism drawn from Brahmanical deities. And so it's at that point that we're getting towards the end of the story that eventually things end up terribly for the three of them, for Law and for Puan and Pang, in that the king, and the father of Puan and Pang, approves of their union. He's very excited to have Law as his son-in-law. But the wife of the slain king of that kingdom, the two princesses' grandmother, is very upset. And so secretly has them all killed by her own guards. And then the story has this dramatic denouement from that point on that ends with the funerals of these characters. Prior to that, though, there's this tension between Law's mother and Law that extends throughout the text. And before he even leaves his own kingdom, he's torn, of course, because he's being pulled by this magic and also by his own feelings, having heard about these two princesses, but he also senses that there's some danger. His mother definitely senses that there's danger and that this is not the right time to go. And so in that, he's trying to decide, his mother's trying to convince him to stay. And this is just a section of his mother trying to convince him that, no, really, think of all that I've done for you. All of, in other words, the ways in which you are indebted to me as your mother. Why can't you listen to me in this context? Let me see if I can adjust the slide here so that it's not cut off. So here I've just put a very, very literal translation so you can get a sense of what's going on. But in essence, this means, remember, this is Law's mother speaking. For 10 months, I held you in my womb, O Lord, the beautiful one, the handsome one. I cared for you without forgetting. In other words, without a single moment of carelessness, not even once. Until, and this here is an epithet for the king, Prapin Raitak, literally the hairpin of the triple wheel, but in this case, the lord over the three worlds, or the lord over the three divisions of the kingdom. Until you were born, I cradled you, I bathed you, I held you constantly, always caressing you, raising you, protecting you. And then she goes on to detail what that entailed. So every day, for each of the three meals, I always fed you, never never having anyone else do that or do it wrong for you. Taking such extreme care for you, my true pair in this life. I'm not wishing to change this at all. Sort of naturally or constantly supporting you until you were able to eat on your own. Arranging, or in this case, carefully preparing food and cooking things for you to eat, never at all being careless or indifferent, not even once. All kinds of things, all kinds of clothes, food, etc. For you, oh child, I counted, I checked, I carefully reflected and prepared, not placing my heart, that is not trusting even a little for someone else to do. From the time you were little, I raised you continuously sorry, where I wrote product, I meant protect. Until you reached maturity, until you came of age and reached this attainment over earth. That means you came into kingship and reigned as king. Why must you now take leave and make me grieve to death in this way? So she's invoking the way that we might see in Buddhist texts that talk about what is this kinds of debt of care that children owe their parents. But here she's using as a way to convince him not to go and seek out this clandestine union with the two princesses, one that I think at that point everybody realizes will lead to certain death. We also see similar themes show up in Vietnamese literature. Again, this is not in the context of something that would be normally considered explicitly a Buddhist text, really not at all. And this is from the national epic of Vietnam, the Trent Walker by Nguyễn Du. And this is a translation, a reformulation of a Chinese novel. But the real genius of the text is not necessarily in the narrative, which is borrowed very, very closely to the Chinese novel. It's not even set in Vietnam. It's really set in China with all the same place names, et cetera. But the genius of Nguyễn Du is as a poet, is how he retells this story in such a beautiful and precise way with his use of language. So the other day when we were looking at a Vietnamese text, I think this was the beginning of yesterday's lecture, we were looking at this form that had 7 syllables, 2 lines of 7 syllables, then 6 and 8. This one is just in this 6/8 meter. The text was originally written in Chữ Nôm, that's the Sinitic looking characters that you see there. And so words that are directly borrowed from literary Sinitic, the characters are the same. For those words that only exist in Vietnamese, the system of Chữ Nôm, or this way of writing Vietnamese using these characters, uses a whole bunch of other characters, usually combined with this phonetic and radical method for representing all of these different Vietnamese sounds, including the ones that don't have any connection to a Chinese word. So that's what's being represented here. On the very top left, you can see how one of the printing of one of the woodblocks that survive for this text. In this particular passage, we're getting to know the character who's the heroine, Kiều, and she has just gone off on an excursion with her brother and sister, and in that she comes to the grave of this deceased singer who met an untimely end, and that the ghost of Nam Tiên, that deceased singer, informs her that she too has an unfortunate fate awaiting her. So she's now beginning to, she's mourning the fact that this is maybe what could be in store for her. So the beginning of this passage here goes, Giọng kêu rần rẫy trúng loang. So the sound of kiều, lamenting or wailing behind, or the truong is this kind of curtain, and lang with a kind of phoenix pattern to it. So her, the implication is her mother hearing that, and the term used for mother, Nhà Huynh, is this very interesting poetic term that connects to a particular kind of plant that has a very, sometimes translated as a daylily, that can be used in medicine and has a very soft and gentle healing quality to it. So the Nhà Huynh is the place where that particular plant grows. Here it's used as a epithet for the mother, and here as a third person pronoun. Nhà Huynh tự tỉnh hỏi cơn cái gì. so suddenly awakes in the middle of the night and asks, like, and what's going on? And this is what she says to her daughter: "Cơ sao trân trọc cánh khuya, màu hoa lê hãy dầm dậy dạo mưa." So what's going on? Why are you tossing and turning here so late at this late watch of the night? And your pear, this is the huale, your pear flower like cheeks, how is it that they're now soaked through with water as if covered with rain? Turan, and this is then Theo replying to her mother, chúc phận ngây thơ, dưỡng sinh đói nợ, tóc tơ chú đền. And this is, she's lamenting that, as she'll explain later, that, oh, this terrible fate is going to befall me. But the first way that she frames this sense of fear or apprehension around this terrible fate is this line, dưỡng sinh đói nợ. So dưỡng is the sense, it means to raise, to bring up. Sinh is to give birth or to be born. Đói nợ, the paired debt. So this paired debt of being raised and having been given birth to by my mother, by my parents, even to the breadth of a hair or the thinness of silk has not yet been repaid. And later in the text, we see, happens a number of times, just picking out a few examples, when she's has this kind of conflict between realizing, oh, this is the way my life is going, but I haven't repaid this most important debt. She ends up in the end, after, I won't summarize the story because it's too long and complex, but there are parts that get more explicitly Buddhist towards the end as she cycles in and out of a nunnery, and there's different questions and reflections on the value of sensuality and chastity in that context. But here is the kind of an early emotional climax of the text. After that meeting with the ghost of Nam Tien, she comes across the man to whom she'll become betrothed, but is not yet married. And while he has to go away for a relative's funeral, I think, she, Gil, that is, comes home one day, and her father and her has been arrested and accused of some kind of financial crime, it seems. And in order to get him out of that, because the family has no money to be able to save him, she ultimately decides to sell herself into prostitution. She doesn't expect that it will be prostitution. She attempts to sell herself into marriage to someone else, but it ends up that she is being tricked, but she doesn't know that yet. But still, she's at this terrible choice because she doesn't know whether to be filial in this context, to repay this debt she feels to her parents, or to the man to whom she just became engaged. So the way it's phrased here is Uyên hỏi ngộ đức cụ lao. So Uyên is a way of meaning something like karmic affinity in this in Sino-Vietnamese. This bonds of karmic affinity, hỏi ngộ, of meeting. That means this chance encounter of meeting this man to whom she became betrothed. And then that's contrasted with đức cụ lao. Đức is, like in the context of công đức, is a translation of merit or sometimes virtue. And here it's the sense of the virtue of cụ lao, of that long and painful, arduous task, meaning the task of raising a child. Chủ tình, chủ hiếu, mến nào nặng hơn. So this word, or this concept of tình, meaning this is from Chinese qing, of the sense of affect or feeling or sentiment, sometimes translated as love, along with chủ hiếu. Hiếu is one of several Sino-Vietnamese words for filial piety. Mến nào nặng hơn? Which side is weightier? Which is more important? And then later on, she says, Lam Gong, to be a child, to be a filial child, one has to repay this debt, repay this virtue. And then she decides quyết tình mẹ mới hạ tình dạy cho đại thiếp bán mình chuộc cha, to sell herself in order to save her father. So this is part of the framing of the whole narrative, these key ideas around debt and virtue to parents. So let's see a little bit how this traces in other forms of poetry and music in Southeast Asia. So this, of course, is a major theme of songs in Vietnam. This is a song from 1959 by the key post-independence songwriter Yi Lung. This song is not necessarily explicitly a Buddhist one at all, though it may be recited and performed at Buddhist ceremonies, particularly Vu Lang. Vu Lang is the annual rite of making offerings to one's ancestors that in a modern day Vietnamese context has been one of primarily offering thanks to one's parents and both those who are alive and mourning those who passed away. We'll look in the next song about a text that's become very important in that context, composed by Thich Nhat Hanh. This one, Lao Mai, goes something like, Thương con thao thức bao đêm. I won't sing it for you now, but because I think I made a typo here, but the key way in which it's being framed are for love and for children. For this care for children, a mother makes all these kinds of sacrifices. For years, she wakes up early and retires late, braving hardships till the day her kids finally grow up, or day and night, her whole heart delights in her kids, her soothing lullaby, an endless echo across the years. So coming back to Alexander's question, we have this tension between this kind of celebration and also articulating what exactly constitutes the debt that children would owe their parents. This song is based on a short essay by Thich Nhat Hanh and was then reformulated into a poem by Phạm Thái Mỹ called A Rose for Your Pocket, or Bông Hồng Cải Áo. And this text, again, very commonly sung for Vu Lang, this important annual Buddhist ritual in Vietnam, is one that, again, tries to articulate what exactly is it that constitutes the debt of a child towards, in this case, their mother. The particular ritual that's being described here is Thich Nhat Hanh in this essay relates a time he went to Japan and saw that there was a tradition of wearing a red flower if one's mother is still alive, and a white flower if one's mother is deceased. And he was moved by this ritual and wanted to bring it to Vietnam. And so that's what's being described here. A rose for you, sister, a rose for you, brother, a rose for any of you who still has a mother, or a mother who's still alive, a mother who still has a mother to fill you with joy. And then we have the ways in which the poetic sensibility here is tied very much to an idealized version of the countryside. So this is in what's highlighted in red and pink or red here. Mãi mãi là lòng mía ngọt ngào. For mother is a sweet sugar cane. Mãi mãi là nải chuối buồn câu. A bunch of bananas, a cluster of areca being that's what's consumed with betel nut. Là tiếng Giấy đầm thâu, the sound of crickets deep in the night. Là nắng ấm nương dâu, the warm sun against paddy and fields. Là bóng liếng yêu thương cho đời. The fund of love that, the fund of love that founds a life. So this another way of explaining it. I'll skip this next song. We can come back to it if you'd like. This is the way some of the same ideas around gratitude towards mothers gets transformed in a immediate post-war context for gratitude towards those who sheltered North Vietnamese or Viet Cong guerrillas in South Vietnam during the war. So this is told from this particular post-1975 perspective, but still bringing in some of these same ideas. So for the rest of the time, I'd like to look at some of, oh, I did Shop's chair. Didn't mean to do that. You can still hear me though, right? I just need to do this again, which will take a moment. I may even have to invoke Jeff, who is over here and has been the masterful tech person. This would be a great time if you have any questions that you want to ask or formulate before we transition in the second half. We'll look carefully at some Cambodian poems that go into a little bit more doctrinal detail around some of these ideas. So we can be looking some at the the perspective of Buddhist themes in texts that are not explicitly Buddhist. Now we'll look at some texts within the Buddhist folds.
So should I go do down that?
Well, I'm going to keep trying to figure out how to re-share this.
Jeff?
People, they have to go that way.
Yeah.
So Eric White has a question. You have emphasized indebtedness to parents in my discussion, yet it seems like indebtedness is felt towards many other beings beyond parents as well. Yes. Does Buddhist poetry always prioritize and foreground indebtedness towards parents in comparison to others? So the text that I want to look into next is one that's usually called Sasao Pratapi, or In Praise of the Earth. My apologies, I just
No worries.
unthinkingly clicked stop share.
No problem, no
Thank
problem. Just be a moment, folks.
Thanks. And so in that text, I think I have to stand
Oh,
like
yeah,
this.
yeah.
In the-
I'll zoom it out. I'll zoom it out so you get a bit more space.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks so much. So in that text,
Just understand.
it begins with the first
You can
priority.
stand.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
With the first priority being given to the earth. And then a list of a whole bunch of other beings, all kinds of deities that are also repositories of guna, repositories of virtue, or are beings to be indebted to or to have gratitude towards. That text is interesting because though it shows up in the manuscript tradition, it's not one for which there's a living performance tradition in Cambodia, unlike the many other texts that focus on gratitude to parents. So similarly to I think the wonderful insights you had yesterday around what's happening with the role of print and the changes that take place. Thank you so much,
You're
Jeff.
most welcome. No worries. Set the camera back.
For the changes that took place in the advent of print, it seemed like these earlier texts in the Cambodian context that articulated gratitude to this much wider variety of beings were not as emphasized in what got printed in the Cambodia case, from the 1930s onward. So I think that's interesting to reflect on, and let's take a closer look at this text and see if it gets at some of what you've asked in that question. So this text is called, again, Sasao Pratapi, or In Praise of the Earth. And the earth here is understood as the earth goddess. This is the figure that Elizabeth Guthrie, who's here with us in the room today, has done such wonderful scholarship on. And it's also understood as the entire earth herself. So it begins, I now shall chant in praise of the earth, majestic goddess, who supports the world's creatures, the birds, the beasts, and all the trees. Her thick soil shows her merit. Her vast extent, some 280,000 yojanas wide, the mass unknown. Mother to all, she supports whole realms and all our homes, never angry or prone to move, despite what we have done to her. We dig deep holes, build villages, carve paths and roads, plant fields of rice and plow the mud. We shit and piss. She doesn't mind. Those who repay their debts to her shall be reborn in lofty thrones and enters heaven, soon attain awakening. So the way this whole text is framed begins with the earth as its foundation, but then it moves into a wide variety of other deities, figures to be indebted to. So we have this brief simile around the nature of papa, or of misdeed or sin in a Buddhist context. And then it gives a framing of what to do. If you seek merit, then repay your massive debts to your parents, your relatives, your preceptor, and your master, as well as your debts to the gods, the moon and stars, the wind, the sun, the rain above, the fire below, and Vaishravana. So Vaishravana here is, here I've translated, is the god of rice. This is Kubera, the god of wealth in another context, but in different Thai and Cambodian contexts, it also gets modeled onto the idea of rice itself is a deity. Sometimes, like in a Cambodian context, it's known as Brahme. Other contexts, can you say it again?
Is it also
Yes, yes. So very important in a Thai and Lao context as well. Helps all succeed as our guardian, a mother to all, a father to blessed with virtues. So it's, as you've pointed out, Eric, there's this broader array of indebtedness to be felt. It could be, what's not being mentioned here is maybe more local deities or those who are involved in a kind of votive relationship to particular deities. That's not so much being framed. The emphasis of this text is around how to engage in particular Buddhist practices, as well as both on a regular basis and those connected to particular moments in the calendar in order to repay these kinds of debts. So it begins after that, after stating what one should do, by then going through the different classes of entities one could have this debt to. So it begins with the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the way of repaying them is to chant the epithets beginning with Itipiso, Bhagawa, etc. And then the way of repaying the Dharma is to chant Savakato, etc. The way to repay the Sanghas to begin the chant in Pali that begins well practiced is the Lord Sangha Supatipanno, Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho, etc. All people should hear the scriptures and chant praises of Buddha's great perfections amassed from birth till nirvana. Listen, wise ones, chant in the morning, chant in the evening, and chant at noon. Hone your practice so that you reach heavenly bliss. Then we have a list of, for very specific kinds of debts, what texts should be recited. So the next line here goes, Buddhas of old repaid their mothers through great sermons on Abhidhamma, the deep teachings that help repay maternal debts. And this is very much the way that the Abhidhamma is framed in sermons and in other kinds of contexts in Cambodia, as well as in Thailand and Laos. To repay their debts to the virtues of their fathers, they preached the tale of Vasantara, the final life of Lord Buddha. I'm not so familiar with this framing of the Vasantara Jataka being a way to repay the debts to one's fathers, but it is certainly what's being articulated in this text. Now we have the chant that we just looked at in Hun's poem that we've begun today's lecture with, that of the Akarawata or Kawata in Khmer. For your teachers who guide the path, you should intone the Akarawata to repay debts and wipe away all trace of sin. Then for kith and kin, in other words, for one's relatives, you should recite one of the tales of the Panyasa Jataka, 50 past lives of the Buddha. And the other text we were looking at yesterday, the Lao Sang Sin Sai, was framed as being one of the texts coming out of the Panyasa Jataka, even though it's not there in all versions. We must also repay our debts to the earth herself, to fire, wind, rain, and Vaishravana, our mothers true who care for us. So repaying our debts to the deities that embody the forces of the natural world, the the elements, and of course also rice that sustains life. Then we have this being plugged into the calendrical context. The fourth lunar month, or Phalguna, usually falls around March, is rare indeed, a crucial opportunity to pay back debts, so take good care. On the full moon of Phalguna, build a stupa of sand, and this kind of sand stupa jadi sai in a Thai or Lao context, or Viluk Teknai, or Un Phnom Ksai in a Khmer context, is a very central practice. Most commonly see it in the weeks preceding the solar new year in mid-April, but it can also be done at other times of year. Here it's advocating making it during this month that precedes that new year in order to build a stupa of sand, to make the central mound, paying your debts to the vast earth. And in Cambodian practice, up to the present, there's one central mound in the center, and then it's surrounded by 4 smaller mounds of each of these sub-cardinal directions. So make a small mound in the southeast. So the big one is, of course, to repay earth. The smaller ones, southeast to pay back fire, who blazes bright as the full moon, endowed with light and brilliant rays. Make another in the southwest to pay back wind. Show thanks to rain in the northwest, and Vaishravana in the northeast. Then we move on to what one does in the next month. And the next month, known as Chaitra, and Chaitra usually falls during the period of New Year in mid-April. Make more stupas for the 3 days of the new year, as the Buddha has guided us. Drop all your work. Of course, these are public holidays during that time. Pray to let go of bad karma. Make your heart calm. Finish the mounds and do good deeds to seal your merit. Bathe all Buddhas and pay respect to monastics. Bow down to all your ancestors and elder kin so they live long. If you're beset with fear and dread of ghosts and ghouls, you must recite the Maha Maitri. The Maha Maitri or Maha Maitrai is an important non-canonical Purita text in the Theravada, really the Cambodian context. I'm not actually sure this is used in Thailand and Laos. Go meditate and to soothe your heart, and then intone the friendly prayers of this sutta. All gods will come and listen close. And then for the repaying the sun and the moon, it brings up these 2 other Purita texts that are often included in Southeast Asian collections, that of the Chanda Purita and the Surya Purita, for the sun and the moon. And then this ends with a closing statement. Follow the path of Buddha, don't be heedless, for such people laden with sin drop to the hells. A reckless man forfeits his own ordained lifespan. Will die alone, as wealth used up and merit gone, so thick as sin. Merit and sin take after us, a long shadow through samsara. There's no way out if you can't lick your lack of care. And I think this is related to the question that you just raised, Alexander. Is a debt repaid through one's intention and subsequent action to repay it, or could also be repaid unconsciously? Does intention make a difference? Does it enhance the potency of the debt being repaid? Absolutely, intention is critical. So this is partially why, when we looked at the examples of aspiration and making offerings in the inscriptions, as well as in the various first texts transmitted in manuscripts, intention is always the first thing. In other words, one has to very clearly intend that, oh, I am doing this meritorious action. And then I am doing it for what purpose? To whom am I dedicating the merit? To myself, to my parents, to all beings, to all 3 of those categories. This is the key element in the repayment of debts within a Buddhist context. I think if we begin to ask this question at the edges of what we might consider a Buddhist context, then we might get some other more interesting answers to your question, Alexander. But certainly what we see being framed here in this text is that one has to do these things with intention. At a particular time, in a particular place, following a set of ritual instructions. Only then is this potency, as you describe it, Alexander, really possible in repaying such debts. Such is the framing of the text. I'd like to move on now. Well, let me pause if you have any questions about this text. Go for it.
So the text actually mentioned about is there any mentioning about the name of the godmother for water?
The godmother for water.
For water, yeah.
No, tell me more about that.
So in Thailand, we call พระแม่คงคา So I don't know if there is any
Oh,
godmother,
in other words,
um,
not godmother in the sense of
parent.
So,
แม่เลี้ยงธรรม, not in that sense, but
No.
the god who is also
Yeah.
the mother.
like
I
deity
understand.
or something like that.
Yes, the word used in Khmer is gongkia in many of
Okay.
these contexts. Yeah.
So do you think
Which is the same as kongka. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So do you think so there is the mentioning about the replay the dead for the mother in the secular literature. Do you think Buddhist poetry play a big role influencing a person who wrote the secular poetry?
I think that's a really interesting and challenging question. So, in the case of Trent Walker, the Vietnamese text, there's all kinds of Buddhist references throughout. Many of those are also in the Chinese text. And particularly ideas around karma and fate and ideas around indebtedness to parents. These are themes that show up throughout East Asian literature as well as Vietnamese literature. Articulating just what is Buddhist and what falls under the category of other kinds of ideologies is really challenging, I think. So I'm not sure how to answer that in terms of what's happening in terms of influence. In the case of Lili Pralaw, I think it's also very hard. We know that text is old. Bickner argues that it predates in some sense, that the overall narrative seems to be a fertility narrative. I mean, that's why there's such a key role given to sex and sex followed by death. That follows from his viewpoint a number of archetypal myths across societies. Which are not really connected to Buddhist ideas, of course. But the way the text has been passed down and the way it's recorded is filled with all kinds of Buddhist ideas. So what does that mean? How can we, understand, is that a kind of influence or not? I think it's an open question.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from John Marston. For what it's worth, the contemporary Khmer poet Yin Luot has at least one short poem in which he talks about the debt to the earth. Oh, fantastic. Oh, I haven't read that. So that's wonderful. And certainly in the broader sphere of 20th century Khmer poetry, there's been a lot of interest in this relationship between the poet and nature. And I'd be really curious to read that in the context of sort of earlier ideas in Khmer poetry around debts to nature, et cetera. Thank you so much for bringing that up, John. I'm going to click this so I can see Gwen's question. Okay, great. Hello, Trent. A question re parental debt again. Are there parallel concepts in South Asia's Indian Buddhism, Brahmanical ethics, or perhaps elsewhere in the non-Asian, non-Buddhist world that is similar to this Confucian/Buddhist concept of hiu? That is xiao in Chinese, filial piety, and its associated sense of hierarchical indebtedness among kins, perhaps in indigenous cultures. So I've been talking about sort of the Buddhist resonances of a term like hiu or xiao, which is really emphasizing this debt between children and parents. That's what gets emphasized most in Buddhist settings. In a Confucian context, we also get this emphasis on the hierarchy between siblings. That becomes, and also how that mirrors hierarchies across the whole social system. That we see less often emphasized in Buddhist texts. But I think certainly in Brahmanical ideas if, and we can ask Ben about this too, within the Dharmashastra world, there are also plenty of ways in which there are non-Buddhist and South Asian ideas around how to structure these kinds of relationships between parents and children. It's sometimes structured in terms of debt. Going back to early Buddhist inscriptions and archaeological findings in South Asia, it's clear that from a very early period, Buddhists were engaged in pious acts in order to transfer merit to their living or deceased parents. That seemed to be particularly important for monastics who left those kinds of inscriptions, but it seemed to be a key concept throughout. So I think this is not really addressing your question, Nguyen, because I don't think there's a way of describing that whole conceptual world that is here, particularly with its Confucian resonances, outside of a Vietnamese or East Asian context. And I'm not familiar with any kind of specific term in an indigenous culture or culture we might frame as indigenous, like in, for instance, upland cultures in mainland Southeast Asia that would have a similar kind of concept. But I think there's a lot more to explore in that realm. Certainly, these questions are ones that have been studied a lot in a South Asian and a East Asian context, but there's been insufficient work done on how they play out contemporaneously and also across time in mainland Southeast Asia. Eric White asks, to what degree do Cambodians in practice follow the guidance of this poem regarding very specific ways to repay debts to specific beings? To what degree do they creatively innovate other ways in response to particular circumstances, constraints, or opportunities? And certainly, Elizabeth Guthrie and John Marston, who are here, who know a lot more than me about what happens in contemporary practice in Cambodia, could speak to this better than I could. In brief, I would say that many of the, like for instance, building stand stupas remains very important in Cambodia. Reciting a number of the different Britta texts that are mentioned is still very important. Is the common way that that's framed by monastics or by lay people connected to these debts to specific deities? In my experience, no, but I was not investigating this anthropologically, so I haven't done the field work to be able to say in some broad sense what people are saying. There's definitely rituals that I've observed, but just because something's happening, it might be framed in a new way. And of course, there is all kinds of creative reframing and innovation that is taking place, and also a way in which older practices are being brought back or renewed in certain ways. So again, this is something that John Marston, who's here, is the world's specialist on, but there's a clear, at least in the way that Cambodians talk about distinctions between different modes of Buddhist practice in Cambodia, between that known as Samai and that known as Buran, between that understood as modernist and that understood as traditional or traditionalist. And within that very broad conceptual framework, temples that are invested in these kinds of modernist practices might not emphasize the building of these sand stupas, whereas others, those who are invested in more traditionalist practices or build their identity around those kinds of practices would. This particular text, the second part of your question, Eric, I have not seen it used as a manual because this is one of the texts that there doesn't seem to be a living performance tradition around. So even though it shows up across the manuscript tradition, I haven't heard it being recited. And that's the way in which there'd be evidence for it being used as a manual in that context. The next text that I'll look at has, again, a lot of very specific details, and it is used as a kind of manual, not a manual for specific ritual actions, but for this process of repentance. So maybe with your questions in mind, we can transition to that text.
Let's just have a quick question.
Sure.
So in terms of paying death for parents,
Yeah.
have you found any texts like anisong or of ordination in Khmer? Because in Thailand, so as an ordination, so we at the first part we ordained as a novice, so it has been regarded as repaid debt for father, and when you become a monk, so it's regarded as repaid debt for the mother. So is there any textual evidence for?
Absolutely, absolutely. So
So we found it in
almost
Lana,
all
in
of
Thai.
the anisangs or anisong texts that are found in Thai, Lao, Lana, etc. contexts are found in Cambodia as well. So for instance, that very text known as anisang is one that has been known I think since the 17th century. That about accords with the earliest surviving manuscript examples in Lana and Laos for the Anisong Mampata, that particular text. So, and aspects of it also show up in Pali in this Central Thai collection, the Paramatmangala. So yes, all of those cultures were constantly sharing and translating texts among each other. It's difficult to have one project at the moment where I'm looking specifically at this Anisong Dhammachai across mainland Southeast Asia and comparing the different versions. But the basic content, yes, is the same. So anything you'd expect in a Thai context or a Lana or Lao context, you would.
What about Sri Lanka and Burma?
Um,
Is there any text about that?
I don't think there's this same tradition of these short anisangsa sermons. That seems to be a particular textual tradition within this smaller world. But the broader ideas around benefits of ordination, of course, are present. But it may not be tied to ideas around benefiting one's mother or father. See, for instance, in the Cambodian context, usually it's the novitiate ordination is what benefits one's mother, and the bhikkhu ordination is what benefits one's father. In esoteric meditation systems, these are then tied to specific parts of the body. In other words, the 12 parts, liquid parts of the body that are the indebtedness or the inheritance from one's mother. This is detailed in Gregory Kurulski's work based on Lao and also other mainland Southeast Asian sources. The individual around the age of 12 is what repays that debt, whereas the 20 or 21 parts of the solid parts of the human body, inheritance of one's father within this esoteric meditation context, those are repaid through by the bhikkhu ordination at age 20 or 21, etc. So those ideas are certainly present. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So about Sri Lanka, like there's like this popular narrative about if one enters monkhood, so the 7 generations would be escaped from samsara, something like that. So it's not like, I don't know whether it's connected to death, but it's like you are in a way bringing entire generations with you to escape from samsara.
Oh, that's fantastic. Can I ask what 7 generations means in the Sri Lankan context?
It's like your father, mother, and like other ancestors.
And so there are different ways in which this is understood in Cambodia, for instance. So sometimes it's understood as the present one and then 6 before.
Okay.
Sometimes it's understood as the present one and 6 following. And then sometimes it's understood as the present one, that is one's mother and father, and then 3 before and 3
Huh.
into the future.
Okay, I have no idea what exactly it means. I
Okay.
think maybe it can depend upon region also.
Yes.
So that is a possibility. But
Fantastic.
at the same time, I have a question
Yes,
about
yes.
this text. And because I think it's coming from Satsati and how Buddha was also repaying to like this tree and all. So is there any mention about that in this kind of poetry, like how Buddha was doing it? Or
Yes, so certainly what we had in this line, sorry. Having trouble manipulating the PDF, my apologies. Buddhas of old repaid their mothers through great sermons and Abhidhamma. So this idea that the Buddha repaid his debt to his mother through preaching the Abhidhamma in Dhammachai Heaven is something that occurs again and again and again. The other thing that I think is relevant is that chants of this genre, also poems in Cambodia, are very frequently retelling the life history of the Buddha. And they're retelling it from the perspective of his relationship with his mother, with Mahapajapati Bodhi, with his relationship with Princess Yasodhara, etc. So these kinds of debts and familiar relationships are the key way in which the life of the Buddha is narrated. And that applies to the present life and applies to past lives as well. So for instance, one text in a Jataka context that gets brought up a lot is Suvarnasama. There's also Mahasila Wirawong wrote an important poetic version of this in Lao as well. In the Khmer context, sometimes the whole story is told, but most commonly it's told in these very short episodes. This is the whole poem that emphasize this way in which Suvarnasama, the Bodhisattva in this particular narrative, is lamenting the fact that in death, he won't be able to care for his parents and fulfill this kind of debt. So that's one way in which we see these kinds of ideas showing up. Is that getting at some of the things you were curious about? Yeah, so.
thank you.
Sure. So let's turn now to another text that I think will be helpful for us here. Well, I'll do it here. Because since I was just talking about the parts of the body and how those are tied to repaying one's parents, this is a text called the 33 Consonants, which then ties those parts of the body to the 33 consonants of the alphabet in a way that is designed to be mnemonic, so that someone can recite and memorize this text to both be able to engage in that kind of meditative practice on the 32 parts of the body, as well as use it as a basis to repay debts to one's parents. So it begins with, I rouse my mind awake and bow my head down low. This is probably a 18th or 19th century Cambodian composition. To my exalted mother, whose virtues are supreme. I honor my dear father and kneel before my preceptor. Note that in the Cambodian context, the mother is almost always mentioned first. The legacy of these three are precious beyond compare. Poor as I am, what can I do but sit by their side at death? I haven't got enough to repay my debts with alms. I've only got my heart and a mind to see clearly the legacies of the three who gave birth to my life. My preceptor translated the pith of Pali words. Everything he taught me holds fast within my body. As for my parents, even lofty Meru can't measure but a third of their soaring grace. And this comparison between the debt of parents and Mount Meru is very common in Cambodian, Thai, and Lao contexts. In a Vietnamese context, it's usually Taishan, the great Taishan mountain in China that's the stand-in for the overwhelming size of this debt to parents. They fed me, cradled me, and nursed me through the night. They guarded me from foes and saved me from all harm. I bring these legacies to mind each day without a lapse. Of course, back to Alexandra's point, it needs to be intentional in this kind of way. Sitting upright, I honor them through their undying signs. The virtues and the consonants are 33 in all. I've learned them as the letters that gave birth to my being. The Pali phrase, imasmin gaye, means within our very selves. Of course, this imasmin gaye is what begins the long list of the parts of the body in Pali. Imasmin gaye ge sa lo ma. And hence inside my body, I find these 33. Then we have the list, each of them paired, a consonant paired to a part of the body. This is, again, tied to this esoteric meditation system in which these very letters are the way in which living beings come to be born. They are generative in that sense, and each tied to these different parts of the body. And then when we won't go through all the parts of the body, but when we come to the end, thus the letters are expounded. Study and see them in your mind. Divide them as appropriate. Memorize them beyond doubt. 21 consonants are gifts of my father. And here it says those from ga to dha, which being the solid parts of the body, and then plus la, the skull here, those are the solid parts. And then my mother gave me 12 from na to ha plus a. The wise know these 33 and honor their true legacies. What great rewards redound to the pious men and women who learn and prize these words. For ancient scriptures say, one who daily chants these letters will take rebirth for hundreds of lives. And here it's interesting that it's not one's whole family that you were describing in the case of monastic ordination in Sri Lanka, but it's talking about just the individual person as a blissful righteous monarch, blessed with beauty and speech divine. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to the text that maybe we'll spend a little bit more time on, and that is this one called Absolving All Faults. So this is a text that does have a living performance practice. And before I dive into it, Ben has a question. Among the sources with which you work, do you see any kinds of links between the idea of debt you're talking about and the notions of debt in an explicitly legalistic sense, i.e. borrowed goods that ought to be repaid with interest? For example, the word ina in Pali. That's a fantastic question. So in the case of, for instance, that word doina, this paired debt of yungunshin, of raising and giving birth to a child, that's the general term for a debt that could respond to a kind of economic debt. However, this term guna, gun or kun, et cetera, in different languages, is not one that's associated with debt in an economic sense. And so there's a certain danger in translating it as debt, where we get this this resonance with these kinds of economic ideas around debt that aren't present within that dimension of the tradition. Others then prefer other kinds of translations like legacy or virtue, etc. But to me, the force of debt is important because all of the verbs that are being used, like thopsanong in a Khmer context, or sometimes thop kun in a Thai context, bao da in a Vietnamese context, all really have this sense of, or traung, et cetera, have this sense of repayment in some sense, even though I haven't seen any texts, in Pali that talk about ina or something like that. So I think that'd be something I'd have to return to the text to see if there is any kind of resonance. It's not something I'm familiar with people talking about.
In Thailand, it's kun ka.
Kun ka,
Kun ka is mean value.
Yes, that's a very interesting way of putting it.
But I don't know where it's
But
come
it-
from.
Yeah, but it
That's-
doesn't show up so much in discussions around bun kun pame, right? That would be, it's used in a much more general sense to describe value. But that's an interesting way in which una and a word that explicitly means price, ka, comes together. That's a great point.
Guilt.
Guilt. Well, this next text, we could apply this term guilt. But let's think about it. I think I haven't translated anything using the word guilt,
Oh, exactly.
but let's think about how it shows up, because that would be one way of understanding what's going on in the text. So this text begins with Bhande Bhava, and this Bhande Bhava is an invocation of a Pali repentance pericope, as well as a particular verse that's used, not a verse, a particular set of phrases in Pali that's used in monastic ordination. So that's what's being invoked by having it at the beginning of the text. So in other words, it's signaling that this is a text of repentance. This is a text of absolution, because it begins with this phrase, Bhante Bhava, venerable blessed one, it's the sense, but it's invoking this broader context of seeking absolution. I place my head beneath your feet, my 10 fingers raised high in veneration above your feet. Then we get the key element of this text. May I take leave. In Khmer, this is Som Lia, like I humbly request Som Lia to say farewell to be free from, to move beyond my own faults from conception up to the present. This is, to me, a very interesting idea doctrinally, because normally we would think that one's unwholesome karma in a Buddhist context is something that, having been committed, it must come to fruition, and if it's an unwholesome karma, it would lead to a unfortunate result. This text, however, is saying that whatever faults have I committed, may I be free from the consequences of those faults. That's the essential idea here. That's this phraseology of may I take leave of my own faults. We see some similar ideas in Thai and Lao contexts as well, not in a more canonical expressions of Buddhism or in sort of more modernist forms, but in a variety of other settings, we see similar kinds of ideas presented, but nothing quite as complete of a picture as we get from this text. So what follows, starting in the middle of the second stanza, is a life review, beginning from the moment of conception up to a full adult life. And here it's told from a male point of view, a full male life. What are all the ways in which we as human beings have inevitably caused harm to others? And how to seek absolution of in regards to those. Could say forgiveness. This is a text about repentance, ultimately. But these are things that one has no conscious control over. I think, again, coming back to Alexander's question, that's the role of intention here is very interesting. So, well, here in terms of how it presents pregnancy, this, if you look at, for instance, the work of Amy Landenberg and others, the idea that the fetus is suffering, that the process of gestation is not just difficult for the mother, but it's really difficult for the fetus, is a key idea in Buddhist texts. And here we get it sort of showing both sides, both the pain of the mother and the pain of the child, but emphasizing the pain of the mother because it's about how throughout life we have caused harm. And then describing the process of gradually becoming a developing fetus, nursed and fed by the umbilical cord, then the body curling around, turning around. There's quite interesting ideas around embryology and obstetrics that's being presented in this text. Like a monkey abused and whipped, I turned and kicked. When my mother ate sweet desserts, joy and pleasure surged within me. But if her fault had too much salt or excess spice, I'd writhe in pain, burning inside, my coiled up limbs shaking in the womb. So this is about the pain of the child. And then we get more about this is the moment of birth itself. I've never quite understood really what's going on here, but at that moment I was careless, not yet conscious, as if first hurled to the final wall that rings the world. This is the Jakawala. This is the wall at the edge of the Buddhist cosmos. And only then leaving my mother. As consciousness arose, I screamed. As for my mother, I had caused her searing pain. She laid above a blazing fire. This is the idea of ang plung in Khmer, yu fai. Is that what that? I'm not sure. I forget exactly how this is described in a Thai context, but after this postpartum rite of laying above a blazing fire. Then we get the faults of growing up. My mother raised and nurtured me. Whatever the cost, she made no mistake. She always bore that weighty task. My mother faced countless trials, sleeping in my urine and feces when I was young. I leave this sin behind. Absolve this fault. My mother cared for me with love, hugging me close as I suckled her breast, even as I bit and beat her chest. And then the father is barely mentioned. Goodbye, the sin of ignoring my father, which the text in a sense ignores the father. But I leave such sins. May my faults be clear. Then we get expanding out this universe of those to whom one owes a debt or those to whom one has caused pain or suffering over this life. So beginning with relatives. I competed and quarreled with my relatives, hurling words of abuse. I was heedless when I fished, taking creatures' lives. I now take leave of those cruel sins. May all hostile remnants, this is the sense of Kampia and Khmer, and Thai, etc. May all hostile remnants be appeased. I lack ideas, skills, and knowledge, so my relatives taught me all I know, but I was careless with their trust and I spit back lies. For all the times I mocked the sun, the moon, or the stars, the lords of the wind, rain, fire, or water, or other gods. Interesting that earth isn't mentioned here. I take leave of those sins. I seek to absolve the fault of deriding the king, lord of the realm, earthly ruler. I take my leave of all such sins, etc. So what happens as we get deeper into the text, we have this interesting contrast between things that are one in theory could avoid, but the text presents them as somehow inevitable. So for instance, in the context of being a monastic, first as a novice, when I was a young foolish novice, my master taught me well, but I was naughty and rude, shrugging him off. I was churlish with my teacher. I cursed with anger behind his back. And then it flips to when I was 21, ordained as a full-fledged monk, I chided and scolded my novice charges, telling them lies to help them learn. In my anger, I snapped at them, my face all red. I glared down at my students, hoping they'd beat their ignorance. I didn't hold back even with my slow-witted kids. I shouted and swore, desperate for them to learn to read the texts. And again, this is the way in other texts we have from this period that monastic education is presented. It was not necessarily one that was always marked by a certain kind of kindness and respect for the pace at which all students might be learning could be different, but rather one in which a certain degree of aggression was understood. Same idea for how it describes violence towards animals. Of course, this text is not advocating vegetarianism, but saying that somehow in the life of being a farmer, it's necessary to have caused these kinds of pain. Or for instance, the way it deals with texts, with practices that it understands from the perspective of this text to not be Buddhist, but nevertheless to be somehow necessary. When I came down with a fever, an astrologer checked for evil forces and found the source. I needed to free the ones I hurt. Free the ones I hurt, meaning to liberate animals, because one had incurred this kind of misdeed or sin by abusing animals. So there are many rites within a Cambodian practice, sometimes connected to the Unisivajaya and other kinds of texts of liberating 2- and 4-footed animals. He told me to tell a healer that I was haunted by those I abused and needed to have a smoke and down a drink after I die. So these were necessary within this non-Buddhist framework, but then the text frames it as, after I die, I'll have to swallow molten bronze, for such intoxicants betrayed the Buddha's pure monastic law. Then we have a section that I still haven't quite figured out how to make sense of. everything else in this text is about things one has done and seeking to be free from. What follows is a whole set of congenital malformities, as well as other kinds of suffering from the perspective of this text within the human condition, like orphanhood or ignorance, that one is seeking to be freed from in a future life. And some of what I've translated here is medical kinds of terms that don't show up elsewhere. So they're not, this is not necessarily the only way to understand what's going on here. For instance, with goodbye pustules, goodbye leprosy, goodbye thrush, impetigo, sores and lesions, rashes and rings, may I never have them. There's a lot to be understood that I'm not able to do about the medical history that's being described in a text like this. But the basic force is that these are, from the perspective of this text, certain kinds of entailments of negative karma. And so to be freed from these consequences goes right along with being seeking to be free from one's particular unfortunate actions. So the same goes for what continues with violating the 5 precepts. And then the part that I'll end with here, this is taking us a bit away from questions of debt, but just to that we see in the beginning of this text, but then it's taking this into this other realm of, and this I think comes back to Eric's question about to what extent are these manuals or anti-manuals of what people are to do. This passage describes in a very vivid sense what people actually do within in this period in going to a temple for different kinds of temple festivities, but from the perspective of the text are framed as misdeeds in some way. Absolve this fault. On holy days, I failed to keep the 8 precepts during New Year, Chumpan, and the Rains Retreat. During these times, I boxed, wrestled, wore ogre masks, held whips and shovels, drank in the temple and defied the Buddha's words, cart races and elephant rides, hair in a turban, shoes on my feet, a parasol above my head, a boast about my shuttlecock game, my hands clutching a sharp chisel. I did such sins and more in the temple in every life. And of course, temple festivals, nganwat in a Thai context, or these kinds of bon in a Khmer context are filled with all kinds of amusements and games, and in some cases depravity that might be framed in a certain way from a Buddhist context, but are nevertheless part and parcel of what it means to celebrate these calendrical or other important rituals. Then it describes, like, what does it mean? What's an ideal way of listening to chanting or sermons, and what are other kinds of ways that people might actually be engaging in? When monks chanted sacred texts and preached the Dharma, I didn't listen. Chin in my palm, I chatted with my neighbors, thinking of other places. Then this way it describes how this relationship between things that are framed explicitly as not Buddhist. I built a shrine for a tutelary spirit, which was very important, this connection with Napa in a Cambodian context. Such shreds are worthless and wasteful. They open the gates to lower realms. But nevertheless, this is part of what makes a life. In the lecture for tomorrow, I'm going to be going into this idea of samvega or shock, the encounter with impermanence. And this text that we're looking at now is actually most often ways it shows up in living practice and in the manuscript tradition is as an end-of-life text, and same for the many texts dealing with shock. And so I wanted to end on it as a kind of bridge. It begins with questions about gratitude and debt to one's parents, or the ways that we have caused harm to mothers, to fathers, etc., in a life, as well as all the other kinds of beings one might have harmed. But as a transition to thinking about what does it mean to, when these poems are recited in an end-of-life context, what kinds of affects does that engender? So let me end here, knowing that we have a little bit of time for questions, but not a huge amount. So my apologies for taking more time than I should.
So it's just, I still can't think of any donations to deities. I mean, like, you make those donations when you build a house, you know, but it's like you're trying to bribe the gods. You're not trying to make up for, yes. Well, I suppose if you dig a post, then you make an offering to, you know, the earth because you dug a post. So that would be, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great.
Kurong Beli stuff.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, okay. Then like in the beginning, you invoke all the gods, so you sort of acknowledge them, but you're not really apologizing. I think.
Yes, yes. No, that makes sense. So the ways in which invocation and seeking apology or bearing witness, these all can merge together in some of these poems, particularly in the relationship between petitioners and the Dharma Sangha, or petitioners and various deities like the elements, etc. Eric has a question. In these Buddhist poems, to what degree is either the character of debt or the method of its repayment gendered, taking on distinct features depending on whether the indebted person is male or female? This is a question I've been very interested in with regards to, I was working on a project on Cambodian nuns and the ways in which motivations for ordination and practice might be tied to either rejecting the family or and the violence of its patriarchal structures, or paying debts to particular family members, often mothers, but others as well. And something that struck me in trying to engage on that project was that there is much that's gendered about the text we looked at just now, this absolving all faults, of course, is very gendered. It's told basically from a male perspective. It's a male life. But many of the other texts, and I'll just give an example here. These are much more commonly recited texts today in Cambodia around filial debts, are neither gendered in terms of what the child recounts what was sort of done to them, nor are they gendered in terms of the method of repayment, as you put it. And same for these kind of texts on asking for mother's forgiveness. Again, there's no particular implication of what's going on there. Same with these kinds of laments that might be discussed in this context, so this orphan's lament. It's told in such a way that it could apply to a person of either gender. The genderedness really comes in with regards to it's the debt towards mothers that gets emphasized more often than debt towards fathers. But there are texts that also focus explicitly on the guna, or the kinds of virtues of fathers as well.
I'm just thinking, that what Dapram at Tonlepati, they have this stone carving that's supposed to be the midwife, where the guy is like, so the husband, I don't know if I really believe this is what it is, but the husband is begging forgiveness from the midwife because it's such a pain to birth a baby. And then the mother has got the placenta in a box on her head. This is how I've seen it explained. Wow. Have you heard this one?
No.
I'm not convinced that that's what's going on. But so that's definitely a gendered absolution. So what, Tonlepati, what is that? It's like late Jai Varman. Like, is that really a woman or is it a dwarf? Is that really the husband? Is that really a midwife? Was there a cult to midwives? It's very unclear to me, but that's how it's usually glossed.
Oh, thank you. That's fascinating.
Wow. So you haven't heard that one before?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
I see it. Oh, it's in like all those old French books.
Okay, thank you.
But that's true. You've got to be really respectful to midwives and apologize up and down. I do know that. So that's gendered.
Yeah.
Midwife's not a god. I think midwife is a god.
So we're getting now, I think, to the end of time, and I want to be respectful of all of your time and not have this stretch on longer than it needs to be. Of course, if you're able to come tomorrow or the next day, any questions you have from today, you can ask them tomorrow as well. You can always email me or email Ben if you have any other questions. I'm happy to address them in that context as well. So again, thank you so much for all of you joining from the Zoom world, for your attention, and of course, very much for your engagement and questions. And then for those of you who are joining us here, thanks again. Such a pleasure to have this chance to talk with you all. All right, see you all
Okay,
tomorrow.
thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
So there's no tradition of apologizing to the midwife. You guys wouldn't know. Why am I asking you?
No.
You guys don't. How about you? Do you know anything about this in Sri Lanka?
Midwife.
Yeah,
That was like
You're
a
supposed
strong
to have this
tradition.
one, right?
yeah, it's a really strong tradition. I mean, there's a whole bas relief devoted to it, so it must have been a big deal, seeing as King sponsored